What we're going to think about this afternoon is God's wonderful creation. And we're just going to take a few minutes away from the busy world to consider the absolute wisdom and the creative genius of the Almighty God, and to marvel at some of the things that he's done. So then, the world that we live in, it's in quite a sorry state, isn't it? Man's selfishness and greed has caused so much destruction to this planet. And yet, even though man has caused a lot of damage to it, the world is still a wonderful place, and it's full of all sorts of incredible creatures and plants and systems that all work separately and together to make this environment ideal for mankind and all of God's other creatures to live in. So let's begin in Genesis 1 then, and that chapter that Dan read for us. And it might be helpful to turn this up, or if you've still got it in front of you, because it's here that God tells us about all the wonderful things that he created. We're not going to go through each day in any great detail, but I'll just bullet point them on the screen because the chapter itself forms a backdrop of what I want us to think about today. So then, on day 1, in verses 1 to 5, the Bible tells us, or God tells us through the Bible, that he created the heavens and the earth and water and light. And God's first recorded words in the Bible are, "Let there be light." And so the whole of the Bible is about God showing people the light of his gospel, right from creation all the way through to Revelation. It begins with that proclamation there in Genesis 1, "Let there be light." And it ends in Revelation 22, verse 5, with there being no more darkness because the light came from God. No more need for the sun because the light came from God. And so at the end of the first day, God looked and saw that it was good. On day 2, he made the firmament. So God took some of the water from the earth and he put it in the sky, and the space in between the water above and the water on the earth he called a firmament. And in that space he made breathable air, the right mixture of gases and so on, and that's where we live, under this firmament. In day 3 he made dry land and plant life. He saw that it was good. In day 4 he made the sun, moon and stars, and he saw that it was good. On day 5, he made sea creatures and birds, and he saw that that was good. And on day 6, he made land-dwelling creatures, and it was good. And finally, on day 6, in verse 26, it tells us that God made man, and it was very good. So that's the 6 days of creation. And when we look at it like that in a list, without all the other words in between, the first thing we see is that everything was created in the right order. So man couldn't have been made on the first day or the second day because there was no land, no food and no breathable air. Plant life couldn't have been made last because all of the living creatures that God made need plants for food, and there would be nothing for them to eat. So everything was created in just the right order. And at the end of each day, God looked at his work and he saw that it was good. And good means that the day's work was complete. It was exactly how God intended it to be, and it was pleasing to him. But at the end of the 6th day, he looked at his creation as a whole and he saw that it was very good. And what that means is that his whole creation was very complete, very perfect. It was exactly how he meant it to be when he first had the idea to create it, and he was very pleased with it. And so on the 7th day, we're told in verse 2 of chapter 2 that God rested. And of course, that doesn't mean that God was tired from all that work. If you have a more modern translation of the Bible, you'll find that it means that his work was complete or finished. And so he stopped creating new stuff because that's there that he wanted. And so because everything was created in a very specific order, what this means is that whatever he made last on the 6th day was what completed it. And in verse 26 and 27, we're told that man was the last thing that God created. And so all of God's creative work was leading up to the creation of man. And I'm going to suggest that that's because creation was for man. And when God made man, his creation was very complete. Man was special, and we know this because the verses tell us that God created man in his own image and likeness, and is the only part of creation that was made in God's image and likeness. And he gave man particular abilities that none of the other creatures have. Man was given the ability to understand God and to respond directly back to him in a way that no other creatures can. He was given the ability to think like God, although many choose not to. The ability to have that special relationship with God. So man was very different to the rest of God's creation. Let's just set that aside for a moment, and we'll come back to it a bit later on. Because God put in place all of the systems that allow life to continue on earth before he created life itself. Then he created plants, then animal life, and finally, when the environment was perfectly ordered, he created man. And he did it this way because he created man to be his children. And we can look through the Bible and find many places that God talks about being a father to his people, particularly in the New Testament. And at the end, we'll think a little bit more about that. But just for now, let's think briefly about some of the scientific detail of our environment. And we'll just think about two of the many systems that God created and put in place that allow life to continue on the earth. So this looks very complicated, but it's not really. If you look closely at it, you'll be able to see that it shows us the global wind cycle. Now, wind is a bit of an unsung hero, really. We only think about wind when it's causing us problems like blowing stuff over or causing damage or even just messing our hair up. So wind is often seen as weather that causes problems for us. But here's some of the reasons why wind is so important. So first of all, wind moves air around, so there can be a constant global distribution of oxygenated air. Clean and breathable air is the most important thing for all life. And it's the rainforests that produce this, the highest percentage of oxygen. And if we could have looked at a map of, say, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, we'd see that there were these rainforests dotted around the earth. A lot of them are gone now or have been reduced massively, but it's the rainforests that produce the highest percentage of oxygen, and it's wind that distributes this oxygen around the world. Plants need wind for pollination and seed dispersal. There are many creatures who rely on the wind for travel or for hunting. Wind moves weather to different regions, and wind can help dry out flooded areas. Remember the Red Sea, how God caused a wind to dry up the sea so that the people could walk across on dry land. And wind can push storms through areas more quickly. And finally, it helps to balance out warm and cold air. There's a lot more to it than that, but as well as the problems that it causes for man, wind also does a lot of very important stuff for the environment. And it's stuff that we couldn't survive without. And the wind just keeps moving around in these cycles, doing the very important work that God gave it to do. And the very wise King Solomon understood and wrote about this in the Bible. The older ones will probably already know this, but in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 6, Solomon wrote, "The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns." And so that's Solomon describing these global wind cycles. Here's another one, and this is probably a bit more recognizable. The second most important thing to life on Earth is clean, fresh water. And what this shows is the water cycle. There it is, says it at the top. And it shows us very simply that clouds hold water. When it rains, the clouds release the water, which ends up on the ground. The rainwater filters down through the soil and eventually ends up in the rivers. The rivers flow into lakes and the sea. The sun evaporates the water from the sea. The water vapor goes up and forms clouds, and the whole process starts again. So it just goes round in this big circle. It's the four shuns, isn't it? The evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and accumulation. And there's exactly the same amount of water on the earth now as there was in the beginning. It just keeps going round and round in this cycle. And so, again, this system is critical to all life on earth. And the Bible tells us about the water cycle. And again, the older ones will most likely already know that King Solomon wrote about this. And it's the verse that follows the one about the wind. And he says in Ecclesiastes 1, verse 7, all streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. And so in very simple terms, that's the water cycle. And Solomon knew about it 4,000 years or so ago. So we can see that God told us about these systems that he created so that life could continue thousands of years ago, long before man thinks he ever discovered them. And there are many other systems and processes that God put in place in the environment before he created animals and man. We've only looked at two of them and very briefly at those, but importantly, God built into these systems a means of recycling everything that's needed for life to continue. And so in a way, God was teaching us about recycling long before David Attenborough or Greta Thunberg ever told us that we should do it, because God's been recycling since creation. So far, then, we've thought briefly about God's creation as a whole, and we've thought about why he created all things. But now I want us to focus in on one particular creature to show that not only did God put a lot of thought into the environment, but he also put a lot of thought into each individual creature that he put in this environment. And the little chap I want us to think about is one that we can easily find in woodlands and fields. And even in gardens all around this country. I've no idea how that picture came up. That just kind of moved on when I didn't expect it to. So the third most important thing to life is food, of course. And in a roundabout way, that's what we're going to think about now. So then, I assume we all had breakfast this morning. What did you have for breakfast? Well, maybe it was something like what you've just been looking at. Or maybe even like this. Or if you're really lucky, you might have had something like this. That's making me hungry just looking at that. But how hard was it to get that breakfast? It wasn't hard at all, was it? So, some of us will have just sat at the table and a bowl of cereal or a plate of toast will have just magically appeared in front of us. Not magic, of course, at all, was it? Mum or dad or husband or wife put it there for us. But even for those who had to make the breakfast, it wasn't too hard, was it? We just went to the cupboard and chose what we wanted and poured it into a bowl and added a bit of milk or put it on a plate and added butter and jam. And there you go, breakfast is served. Granted, the full English there would take a little bit longer and be a bit more difficult. But the little creature we're going to think about now has to work harder than most to just get a small part of his food. So we're going to think for a few minutes about the woodpecker, and in particular, the green woodpecker. Some of you may have heard of him already. You may even have heard talks about him, but those people who believe in evolution, who take the view that there is no God, those who believe that we all evolved from a single-celled organism a little bit at a time over billions of years, if what they believe was true, then this little fellow wouldn't have lasted long at all. He would have died out very quickly. But he didn't, and he's still here and can still be seen alive and well in our countryside. In fact, there's at least one pair of these nesting around where I work at the moment. So one of the most important things every creature needs to survive is, as we said, food. And that's what we're going to think about now, not the food itself, but how the woodpecker survived the process of getting that food. Because if he wasn't made the way that he is, he would have big problems. So first of all, the woodpecker's main diet, it's freely available and in abundance on the ground. So if evolution supposedly improves a species, why dig in the tree in the first place? Why does he peck at trees? Or why dig in a tree to build a nest when he's perfectly capable, like other birds, of building a nest in the branches? Why take that risk? And the only answer that makes any sense at all has to be that God created the bird and he created him to do exactly that, because there are so many variables that evolution can't answer. There are too many things that would all have to evolve at exactly the same time and in an instant, because pecking the tree doesn't improve the species in any way. Instead, it puts the woodpecker at a greater risk of extinction. And so this in itself is proof that God created him. So let's think about the woodpecker from the angle of getting food. This is what the woodpecker's main diet is made up of. Grubs, ants, beetles, centipedes, insects, stuff like that, that he finds around on the ground. So he doesn't really need to peck the tree to get his food, does he? And yet he does. So the first problem for him is staying on the tree. You see, woodpeckers can peck a tree at an estimated 20 to 25 times a second. You even try saying da 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 20 times in a second, and you may get 3 or 4, but never 20. Try it sometime for yourself. I tried and I only got 3. And so that's some pretty fast moving from the woodpecker, isn't it? I'll bet you're all saying da 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 in your head right now, aren't you? But this is what it sounds like, and hopefully you can hear this. Hopefully you could hear that okay, but that's how fast and hard the woodpecker pecks the tree. And when you combine that speed with the force that the woodpecker hits the tree, each peck, for those scientifically minded, each peck results in a calculated stress equivalent of up to 1,000 times the force of gravity. So that's more than 250 times the force to which an astronaut experiences during a rocket takeoff. So he's really belting his head against a tree trunk. And with all that force and speed, how does he stay on the tree? Well, if his feet were like any other bird's feet, the first time he hits the tree with all that force, he's going to fall off. He'll lose his grip on the tree and not be able to get to the food. But God thought of this, and so he gave the woodpecker special feet. Most birds have 3 toes at the front and 1 at the back. If you can see in the top inset there, that's a pigeon's foot. But most birds have that same arrangement. If a woodpecker's feet were like that, when he leaned back to take a swipe at the tree, his whole body weight is supported just by 2 toes at the back. But God gave the woodpecker special feet. He gave him 2 toes at the front and 2 at the back. And you can see that in the bottom inset picture. And because of this arrangement, he's able to move very easily and very quickly upwards and downwards, left and right, and even upside down. And because he's got 2 toes at the back and 2 at the front, he has twice the amount of grip on the tree trunk. And so he can peck with all that force and speed without falling off. And so God gave him special feet. But if he only had special feet, he'd still have big problems. You see, when he leans right back to take a good hard swipe at the tree, all of his weight is balanced on his back 4 toes. That's 2 on each feet. And at the point his momentum changes direction from going backwards to going forwards, he'd still start to lose his grip and so fall off the tree and not be able to get his meal. But again, God thought of that. And so he gave the woodpecker a super strong tail. His tail feathers are very different from all of his other feathers and different from the feathers of other birds, because although they're fairly short compared to other birds, they're very strong and spongy and made of a resilient type of material that's different from other feathers. And this means that the woodpecker can use his tail as a tripod with his 2 feet. And you can probably just see that in the picture on the right, where he's pushing his tail against the tree. This means he doesn't just rely on his actual legs to push forwards. He uses his tail feathers like an extra leg to help support him and push him forwards into the tree. So now he can grab hold of the tree with his special feet and lean right back, pressing his super strong tail feathers against the tree and get ready to bang his head into the tree. But if that was all he had, he'd still have problems, because now he's going to hit that tree with full force, using his beak 20 times a second for, say, 5 seconds. So if he's going to hit the tree 20 times a second for 5 seconds, how many times is he going to hit the tree? I can't hear you, but I'm sure you're all shouting 100. So he's about to bang his head into the tree trunk as hard as he can, 100 times in 5 seconds. What happens when we bang our head? Well, if we get a small bang, we might get a bruise and a little bit of pain. If we get a medium bang, we could get concussion when the brain hits the opposite side of the inside of the skull. If we get a hard bang, we could have broken skull bones or bleeding in the brain, or loss of consciousness, or even death. So we've all been 10-pin bowling, right? Well, the fastest speed a ball has been measured in 10-pin bowling is 21 miles an hour. And if you imagine being hit on the head by that 100 times, that's effectively what happens to the woodpecker in these 5 seconds. And that would really do some damage, wouldn't it? So how does he avoid getting hurt? Well, any idea what this is? Well, this is a shock absorber from a car. It's that bit of a car that stops you being shaken to pieces when you're going down bumpy roads. And it's called a shock absorber. And as you can see, it's made up from quite a few different parts. So, and they all work together to reduce the impact of the bumps that the car goes over. Now, if you take just the smallest part of the shock absorber away, the whole thing stops working. Well, God has given the woodpecker a similar arrangement in his head and in his beak. And like the shock absorber in the car, it's made up of several different parts that all make up his shock absorbing system. And if you take just one of those parts away, it no longer works. The woodpecker dies. So first of all, inside your skull and mine, there's a small space between your brain and the inside of your skull. And if we bang our head on the front, because we have this space between the brain and the skull, our brain moves backwards suddenly and hits the inside of the back of our skull. And that's what causes the damage. Well, the woodpecker doesn't have that problem because his skull is designed by God so that his brain only just fits inside his skull. So when he hits his head, his brain doesn't move at all. And because of that, the damage is reduced. The next part of his shock absorbing system, you can see there in the pink where the top of his beak meets his head, and the blue shaded area where his lower beak is attached. This is a kind of spongy type of cartilage tissue that absorbs and breaks up a lot of the force of the impact. And so again, the damage is reduced even further. And for the last part of his shock absorber, God gave the woodpecker a beak that is super strong and has a very clever arrangement of muscles. It's designed in a way that when the beak hits the tree, the upper part of the beak moves upwards and forwards, and at the same time, the lower beak moves downwards and backwards. And this movement deflects again some of the impact and protects the woodpecker's beak from shattering under the force of the hit. And when you put all of these parts together, it forms the ultimate shock absorber, and there's no damage at all to the woodpecker. He spends his whole life pecking trees with zero damage. And when you think about it, all of these parts that make up the woodpecker's shock absorber had to be in place and working together properly before the bird ever thought about trying to peck a tree. If there was one small part missing, he would have died at the first attempt. So then, now he has his special feet, he has a super strong tail, and he has shock absorbers in his head, but he still can't get the bugs out of the tree trunk, because the next problem is, how does he know where to dig for the bug that might have burrowed deep into the tree? Well, God gave the woodpecker extremely good hearing, so that when he lands on a tree, he moves up and down the bark, gently tapping at the trunk with his beak. And they call this drumming because it's a gentle tap. It's not the big hitting sound that we heard earlier. And as he taps, he disturbs the little bug deep inside the tree trunk. And the bug only has to move the tiniest little bit for the woodpecker to hear and to know that it's there. It's a bit like if someone's asleep in a room and there's a noise outside or in the room, and you kind of don't fully wake up, but you just turn over a little bit in your sleep. That's what happens. And as soon as the bug moves, the woodpecker hears it and starts digging. So now the woodpecker has special feet and a super strong tail. He's got shock absorbers in his head to protect his brain and beak, and he's got extremely good hearing. But if he only had this, he'd still have a problem getting his food from the tree, because having found the bug, he's now got to get it out before he can have his breakfast. And of course, the bug doesn't want to be the woodpecker's breakfast, so the bug is going to make it as hard as possible for the woodpecker. But God thought of this too, and so he gave the woodpecker a very special piece of equipment to help him. Apologize if that's slightly blurry, but God gave the woodpecker a fantastic tongue. The woodpecker's tongue is completely unique. There's no other tongue like it in all of creation. It doesn't start in his throat like every other creature. His tongue starts where the skull bone meets the beak, and it travels all the way around the top of his skull, underneath his skin. Hopefully you can see that by those pictures there. When it gets to the back of his neck, it splits into two parts and goes round his throat and then joins back together again before coming out of his beak. And if that's not clever enough, his tongue is very long and slender, and he can stick it out of his beak by about 25 centimeters. So that's a very long tongue. If I just do that, that's his tongue there. It looks like he's eating a massive worm, doesn't it? But it is his tongue. And because it's so long and thin, he can get it right down inside those bug tunnels in the tree. So please excuse my poor artwork there. But you can see that the tip of his tongue in that little inset picture is very hard, and it's shaped like a spearhead, and it's covered in tiny barbs that point backwards, so that once he's speared the bug can't escape as it's being brought back down the tunnel. And to work with this fantastic tongue, God gave him an extra special set of salivary glands that make a sticky glue-like substance that coats his tongue. And again, this helps to make sure that the bug can't get off as he's transporting it back down the tunnel. But amazingly, these glands don't just make the glue, they also make a substance to dissolve the glue, so that when he's got the bug back into his beak, the woodpecker doesn't risk swallowing his own tongue along with the bug. And so God really has thought of everything for the woodpecker. He's given him special feet, a super strong tail, shock absorbers in his head, extremely good hearing, a fantastic tongue with its own glue factory, and now the woodpecker can safely and efficiently get his food from the tree. So what we've seen briefly with the woodpecker is an incredible combination of systems and body parts that work together to allow this little chap to build his nest and to get his food from the trunks of trees. There's so much more detail that I don't have time to explain in this short time. But when you think about it, all of these parts had to be in place and functioning properly right from the start. Gradual change couldn't have done this. This is genius design and instant creation. So we've only looked at this one area of the woodpecker's life and habits, but I'm sure you'll agree that there's only one way that this could have happened, and that is that it was designed and created by a mind far greater than ours, the mind and the power of the Almighty God. And if we examine all other aspects of God's creation, we'll find the same genius design, the same care and attention to detail, the same perfection. And all of this should give us cause to praise the great God of creation and give the glory to him. So now, before I finish, I want us just to connect back to God as a Father, because he is the Almighty Creator, whose wisdom and power and creative genius have created all these things that we've thought about and so much more. His glory and his majesty are beyond our comprehension. He is a God of purity and perfection, and every single thing that he does is right. He's all of those things, and all of our praise and all of our worship and all of our service is what he is due. But he's also a God of tender love and mercy. He's a father to those that believe in him and trust him, and who come into his family through baptism, and who return that love to him and try to live their lives in a way that's right with him. And we see all of this in his creative process. And just to try and demonstrate this, here's a list of some of the things that a man and woman think about when they get married and decide to start a family. If they're sensible and responsible, this is what they do. They prepare an environment. First of all, is the house big enough? If not, do we need to move house or build an extension? Is the garden safe? Do we need to put up good fences and safe gates and plant safe plants and so on? Is the house safe? Do we need to put up stair gates, heater guards, ornaments out of reach, and so on? Then they prepare a room and they put suitable furniture with nice colours and children's toys and books and so on. Then they decide on a set of rules, principles, or strategies that they will use to teach the child about their own values and about right and wrong. And they do all of this before the baby is born, so that the whole environment is complete and ready for the child. And they do it because they anticipate the loving relationship that they'll share with their child. And when we think about it, these are all the things that God did back in Genesis 1, aren't they? He provided an environment where his children, man, could grow and learn in safety, where there was nothing to harm them. It was a place where all of their needs were met and catered for, and it was a place that they could enjoy with all sorts of colourful and interesting creatures and plants. And it was a place where they could learn about God and his values. And so God, as a father, created this wonderful world for his children to grow in and to enjoy. But sadly, most of mankind have turned away from him. Now, most, if not all of us, as parents, will have opened their children's bedroom door at some point and been greeted with something like this. This is the environment that we lovingly created for our children, and they just messed it up. But that's not how it started out, is it? Or at least I hope it's not. When we first created this environment before our children were born, it didn't look like this at all. And with some time and effort, we can make it look like this again. And this is what God sees when he looks down at his creation. He sees the mess that mankind has made of this environment that he lovingly created for them to enjoy. And part of the great work that Jesus will do when he comes back will be to put a stop to the destruction and to clean it up, the mess that mankind has made, and return God's creation to its original condition where everything was very good. And God willing, all of us here today will have an opportunity to help Jesus with that work. I'm really looking forward to that time, and I'm sure you all are too, because it will be a time of great joy and blessing. It will be a time when we'll be able to see and understand and enjoy God's creation as he intended it to be and as it was in the beginning. So in your Bibles, turn finally, if you would please, to the last book, the book of Revelation, chapter 21. I'm going to put it on the screen anyway, because here God gives us a little picture of the kingdom. And it says in verse 3, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God, as he was with Adam and Eve in the beginning. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. And so this wonderful world that God created, with all of its diversity of life, and that man has messed up, will be restored to its perfect state as it was in the beginning. No more sin, and consequently no more death. Nothing that will trouble or mar God's creation, because here he promises that he will make all things new. All of the damage that man has caused to the environment will be put right, and we will see God's creation how he intended it in the beginning. Sadly, Jesus isn't back yet, and so while we wait for that time, let's make the most of the time that God's given us to enjoy and appreciate all of the things that he's created, and to acknowledge his wisdom and his glory in creation. And let's do what we can to look after it. Thank you all for listening so patiently.